And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Okay, guys. I just got done reading Patrick Peters' book, Botched Victory: How World War II Caused Vatican II and Corrupted the Christian West. And I got to tell you, it's one of the most fascinating reads that a book I've ever read, as he puts into very plain language and historical context exactly what a lot of us integralists have seen for the past 70, 80 years post World War II, and the ill effects that World War II had as a result of how the war ended, and then the effects that it had on the West as a whole, with the church taking a back seat because of the infiltration of Freemasonry and Marxism into the church, and to that, greater extent into the wider culture of the West. But what he does in this book that I've never heard too many social commentaries in sort of in the English language tackle on was the Italian politics post World War II. And this to me is the most fascinating part of the book. Now, the book is fantastic from beginning to end. He starts off with the message of Fatima and Our Lady, goes into again things like your basic philosophical foundations of Christendom and how we view the world, World War One and the consequences of World War One. But then we get into sort of the fascist regime in Italy and sort of the effects of fascism, why they rose, what they actually did, and really how they conformed to Catholic social doctrines better than any other modern political ideology ever has within the realm of the Catholicism. And I don't want to put words in the author's mouth here, but it sounds like he's making the same case I've made for a long time. And that is that because Mussolini, post the Lateran Accords and his conversion late in life to the Catholic faith, it sounds like he's making the case that really Mussolini was the last temporal defender of the church. And the problems of the church really begin after Mussolini's assassination, because now the church was left at the whims of liberal democracy. And this is where it gets fascinating because, we've gone through these ideas of what fascism, Italian fascism, remember that, tried to do in Italy, how it tried to govern, under what circumstances, what the nuances were, and why that movement rose, and how it protected the faith, right? Because Mussolini worked pretty good with Pope Pius XI. I don't want to hear about Non abbiamo bisogno. I've covered it on my Mussolini series. There's more nuance there to that issue. But even more so, what he touches on that I think is very big, very huge. Again, you don't hear a lot of this in the English sort of context, is the Italian political fallout of democracy, the post World War II democracy, beginning first and foremost with the 1946 election that effectively took out the king and replaced it with a parliamentary system. The 1946 election, notoriously corrupt. 2 years later, 1948, you had your first parliamentary election in Italy, post, again, the fall of fascism. Another election that was notoriously corrupt, because remember, there was a battle for the soul of Italy between America and, of course, the Marxists coming from the Soviet Union, and the politics that followed, and really a lot of the poor choices that the church made. And now, when I say poor choices, it wasn't like they had a lot of good options. And push come to shove, the church is forced to make concessions or at least deals with the Christian Democrat Party that rises in 1948, a Christian Democrat Party in Italy that's, well, let me put it to you this way. It's a big tent approach, kind of like, us here in the States, vote for the Republican Party because it embraces all ideas and it tries to bring a coalition together to defeat the dastardly leftist Marxists in the Democratic Party. the Christian Democratic Party was exactly that in Italy in 1948. And Pope Pius XII felt that he had to side with the Christian Democrats in order to keep the hardline Marxists out of power. As you know, Stalin was having his influence, and there was a race for the soul of Italy in that respect. And what Patrick Peters notes is that the Pope didn't have much of a choice, and he embraced it. The problem, of course, was that not only were these political parties infiltrated by the socialists and the Marxists, but they were infiltrated by the mob, they were infiltrated by the Masonic lodges, and Pope Pius XII himself, top aides within the Vatican, were planted Freemasons. And everything that was happening now in a post-World War II setting without Italian fascism to protect against some of these nefarious elements, it threw the church into a political whirlwind, which would affect the internal structure of the church and lead us to the chaotic, dogmatic what do you want to call it? The problems of the church today, the modernist infiltration of the church. And he goes on to touch on all of these issues. So the book really outlines before World War II and after World War II and all the way into Vatican II and some of the players that get us into this sort of the problems of the modern church and ultimately the problems of the liberal West and the infiltration of every institution. In this case, he goes into detail about the church's struggles and eventually, of course, about the politics and the cultural struggles that have sort of swamped the West post World War II. And so the book is absolutely fantastic here. It's well written. Listen, I don't want to say here that I agree wholeheartedly 100% with everything Mr. Peter says, but it's got to be 99.9%. I mean, his contextual understanding of history is exactly the way I've laid out on this show for the most part. Though I do learn a lot from Mr. Peters in this book. Again, the Italian politics is fascinating, guys. You got to understand Italian politics to understand the crisis in the church, and he touches on that. What else does he touch on in this book? Let's see here. He does distinguish between Italian fascism and Nazism, saying that they're different variants. He does call Nazism a demonic ideology. In this book, he does not like Nazism at all, and says that it's really not really anything like Italian fascism because in popular liberal culture, both Italian fascism, Nazism are kind of thrown in the same camp. That's kind of the shallow view of history to kind of dismiss what was happening in Italy at the time, of course, and to support again the various factions that were fighting over the soul of Italy after the war. Let's see here. Ooh, Nazism, communism, a comparison. Listen, we get into America as well too. America's first against the communist infiltrator, Pearl Harbor, a communist inside job. Listen, we do get into American politics and the notorious characters within the FDR administration, particularly Morgenthau and Harry Dexter White, who winds up being a communist spy, according to the Venona Project, right, which were secret cables that were de-siphoned from the Soviet Union. We get into World War II and America's entrance and FDR and all that stuff, and some of the problems there, of course. We get into a lot of the popes and the wisdom of a lot of popes, especially Pope Pius XII, who didn't have a lot of good choices after the war. It's interesting because he says that Pope Pius XII was surrounded by Freemasons. Now, what's fascinating about this is that my wife just picked up the novel by Malachi Martin called The Vatican. And in that book, and I'm not sure the publication date on that, I got to get that. My wife was reading it to me actually last night, and it confirms that Pope Pius XII's top aide was a Freemason. And I know this because what he says in it was that Pope Pius XII wanted to save Mussolini before the partisans assassinated him, and sent this Freemason, who he had no idea that his top aide was a Freemason, to go cut a deal with the partisans, the communist partisans, to bring Mussolini back to the Vatican to try and save Mussolini. But of course, his top aide was a Freemason and undermined Pope Pius XII. His attempt to get Mussolini back was half-assed, and as the story goes, and I'm going to be talking about this soon, the assassination of Mussolini goes down the way it goes down. But we know that Pope Pius XII was surrounded by Freemasons in the Vatican. Now, what's fascinating to me is that, again, both Mussolini, and you could argue probably Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII, they were all surrounded by Freemasons. I think the difference is that, with Mussolini, fascism really suppressed Freemasonry. And a lot of people probably would have said that, probably the problems in the church probably wouldn't have been as relevant post World War II if the war had gone differently and Mussolini survived in power. Of course, he did survive in power, which left the church at the whims of liberal society. Hence, the infiltration of Freemasonry in the church and everything that goes with Freemasonry that we see later on. He includes in this the sort of the church sex scandal, the pedophilia issue. Again, the rise of the homosexuality within the church. It's all preceded by this Masonic infiltration into the church. And so, in that sense, Mussolini, along with the popes, wind up being betrayed on all sides, right? Mussolini betrayed by Freemasons in the Grand Fascist Council. Remember, the king was a Freemason himself. And here we are now within the realm of the Vatican and the church. Pope Pius XI, Pope Pius XII, there's already a Masonic infiltrators within the Vatican itself. And at every turn, it seems to be Freemasonry there that has a hand in dictating policies. And one of the things was really to embrace the Christian Democratic Party. Because really, again, the choices, they weren't good, without a doubt. But with the Christian Democratic Party in Italy, it had this all-encompassing ideology to try and keep the dastardly Marxists out of power. So in doing so, you bring in lots of nefarious groups, right? You bring in the socialists and the Marxists that are not sort of these, peasant proletarian revolutionaries. They're kind of the guys that will kind of push Marxism, but much lighter without the oppression, but infiltrate your ranks. They pushed out all the far right-wing groups, which were the neo-fascists. They pushed out the monarchists out of the Christian Democratic Party. Pope Pius XII felt he didn't have a lot of options because you don't want Stalin taking over Italy, because he saw what the Marxists did to the church during, with the Tsar during the Russian Revolution. That was his biggest fear. He thought he had to, again, cut a deal. But what is even more interesting, what Patrick Peters notes here is that one of the plans that Pope Pius XII had was to use Catholic Action, not as a political party, but as a foundation of sorts to build a political party. Remember, Catholic Action was this idea by previous popes to try and restore Christendom within Europe, 150 years after the French Revolution and all of its moral depravity had wreaked havoc throughout the culture. Catholic Action was again, a Catholic Vatican program or idea that was to reestablish, again, Christendom in Europe. And he trusted that through Catholic Action, that the Christian Democratic Party could be controlled and be a de facto Catholic party. Because, for Catholics, it's difficult, this politics thing. We don't try and be, what do you want to call it? A theocracy. The church believes in a separate from the state, though the church should influence the state. This is why Patrick Peters says the balance between Italian fascism and the church, the way they had it throughout the reign of Pope Pius XI, was a perfect mix of how social doctrines and the church and government should sort of work together within society. But now we're in parliamentary governments. Pope Pius XII believed that Catholic action could steer the Christian Democratic Party in the right direction to give it a heavy Catholic slant. First of all, to keep the Marxists out, keep Stalin out, but also to restore and maintain Christian virtues and Christian sort of ideologies and principles within Italy. The problem was, as Patrick Peters notes, is that Catholic action, just like Mussolini about 15 years earlier, figured out Catholic action was infiltrated by Marxists and by Freemasons. And this is why the Christian Democratic Party, which really governed Italy between 1958 and 1994, was as corrupt as can be. And it broke down not only the political structures in Italy, but it broke down the moral structures of Italy. It effectively, through this massive compromise, this big tent approach, this conformist approach, it really de-Christianized, de-Catholicized Italy. And that is the great crime of that era. And he goes through a lot of the statistics and really in many ways, a lot of things we suffered from in America, as I've told you here before, right? 1961 in America, the pill is made over the counter. And after that, every social issue that the church and we Catholics have ever opposed and warned the world about collapses, right? It's the pill in 61, divorce and remarriage is legalized a few years later, pornography, is legalized a couple years later after that. Then we got what else? Contraception, that falls in terms of legality, shacking up out of wedlock, single parent homes, Murphy Brown, gay marriage, transgender, it all collapsed in America starting in the 1960s. Well, you have a similar situation in Italy, as Patrick Peters notes in his book, and that is, it was in 1970 that divorce and remarriage was made legal. And he said that was the catalyst for Italy. And 5 years later, abortion was made legal. I don't know about the pill. He doesn't mention contraception, when that was legalized in Italy, at what point. But I guarantee you, if you're already allowed for divorce and remarriage and abortion is made legal in 1975, the pill is in there somewhere in between those years, roughly right around there. So again, democratic sort of, what do you want to call it? Democratic sensibilities within the realm of this giant conformist sort of liberal ideology to make sure that the evil Marxists never win. Same thing that happened in America, and really same thing that's happened throughout all of the West for the past, since the end of World War II. Patrick Peters notes this. It's the same game plan everywhere. It's cultural Marxism, but even more so, he touches on here about some of the problems with globalist, right-wing, classical liberal economics. Something else that I told you guys about, the breakup of the family, right? Splitting the family up because of global economics. Just go out there and make the money in the economic engine of prosperity, and we'll all be happy. And yet, right, the more money we've made, the more miserable it seems like the West has become. More depression, more drugs being used, addiction to pornography, addiction to food. Our health has collapsed. Our mental capacities have collapsed. The family has been ruined and destroyed. The culture is run to the core, all in the guise of, as long as we all make the money, everything's going to be okay. And of course, making the money has not been the solution to modernity. It's only made the problem even worse. And Mr. Peter touches on all of these. Let's see here. Okay, so we talked about here the battle for Italy and its politics after the war. Then we get into the church stuff. Montini and the Roman party, Vatican interference in the 48 election. Remember, the Vatican wound up working with the State Department and with the mob. And he does get into the Vatican bank scandals and how all those scandals went down, right? Lots of nefarious characters cutting deals with groups that the church never should have cut with, all in the name of fending off the dastardly Marxists from the East, right? All these compromises that were made. Christianization, the Christianization or de-Christianization of the church, Operation Sturzo. We get into John the 23rd, right? who was supposed to open the third secret of Fatima in 1960. He looked at the envelope, put it back in, and said, "This is not for my pontificate." That's something that I've gone through in the past as well too. Christian Democrats opening to the left, right? Just like the Republican Party. Classical liberalism historically has been an opening to Marxism and communism in America. Same here. The Christian Democratic Party was an opening to the left. And the church, again, beginning with Pope Pius XII, even though he was a good pope, as Patrick Peter notes, it is really John the 23rd, but even more so, Paul the Sixth, that conforms this relationship with the Christian Democratic Party, that begins to decatholicize the Italy as a country. Let's see here. Hijacking of the council. He does get into Vatican II, religious indifferentism and the weaponization of the Holocaust. Listen, we get into the issues in the vague language of, I forgot the name of the specific document, Nostratate, I believe what it was. I could be wrong on that. And the problem, the issue of the Jews, and the vague language on how the post-Vatican II church is supposed to deal with the Jews. Well, before World War II, there was much stricter terms on how Catholics were and Jews were supposed to relate to one another. Let's put it that way. Let's see here. Oh, the council's fruits and the problems that came after the council. We know that the priesthood collapsed, all the nuns, all the numbers started collapse of everybody going into those vocations there. What else here? Okay, Vatican Bank scandal 1, Vatican Bank scandal 2. Again, the church is involved. It's got its own bank. Initially, the church having its own bank made sense, so foreign countries don't hold you hostage when you're trying to maneuver money and funds and trying to get the mission, the gospel across the world. But again, once you merge the Christian Democratic Party with the church in an attempt to save Italy or save Catholicism, but the Christian Democratic Party brings in all these nefarious forces, including the mob, including the P2 Lodge, including a bunch of other socialist and Marxist groups, it's bound to be a tangled web of contradictions and nefarious characters who use the Vatican Bank, right, for money laundering operations. What else you got? Freemasonry in the Vatican, right? I touched on it earlier. Clearly, Freemasons entered the Vatican. Bonini was one of them, and there was a couple of other ones he names here. I forgot the other one. Bonini obviously changed the mass, or at least was an influence on changing the mass. But the other big cardinal that was a Freemason, I forget his name now, he was in charge of appointing bishops and cardinals from like throughout the 70s and 80s. And Peters argues that probably was the most ill-affected, probably even more damaging than what Bonini did as a Freemason, considering that he helped elect the College of Future Cardinals, right? What else we have? The strange death of John Paul I. John Paul I. Again, conspiracy theory, nobody really knows, right? But the idea was John Paul I might have ruffled some feathers going back to tradition. We don't know for sure. But it was I think he lived 33 days, a strange death. He goes into a little bit of that. He doesn't get in too far down the conspiracy, right? He only touches on those issues where they can be proven. In the case of John Paul I, he says, listen, I can't prove this. Nobody really knows, but we can speculate because this is what we have. This is what we saw, right? The humanist crisis, the bitter fruits of victory. Okay, he gets into a lot of the culture and humanism, the problems of Marxism in the culture, cultural Marxism. Again, even classical liberalism as being a gateway to give Marxism power. Let's see here. Defining the terms Marxism, species, being, and alienation, gets into Marx, gets into the Marxist ideology. Philosophically, right? Marx, capitalism, and crude communism, anti-Russian errors of Russia, cultural Marxism, and the Sovietization of the West. This one's interesting because he touches on how normie conservatives, right, Republicans, classical liberals, American conservatives were conned throughout the Cold War. They were they were so dead set on fighting sort of this militaristic operation against the Soviet Union. When he says that really after Stalin, many of the Soviet leaders, they were kind of weak leaders in the Soviet Union. First of all, none of them were as motivated and bright as Stalin, but also those Soviet leaders after Stalin were not bloodlusty. They were not bloodlusting like Stalin was, and so they were kind of weaker Soviet leaders. And again, the propaganda that sweeps through the West in the midst of a Cold War. Here come the classical liberals, dead set on fighting communism and the Soviet Union in sort of this worldly militaristic sense. When all the while Marxism changed, right? We went from this Stalinist sort of institutional Marxism into this cultural Marxism that was began to be pushed by the likes of Gramsci, who says, you know what? You don't suppress the proletariat. You don't dehumanize people. You get into the culture. You break up the culture. You break up the family. And here comes cultural Marxism that was really paving the way for the destruction of the West throughout the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And the classical liberals never saw this coming, right? They never saw it coming. Culture, let's see here. Humanist triumph, right? Talks about humanism. And again, the ideas of how these fake sort of ideas or abstract ideas of freedom and liberty, and how they take us away from the true faith and really usher in Marxism into the West, what we're living through today. And of course, the ushers of globalism, and then close out with our promise of the lady. And his ultimate conclusion at the end is, listen, we got to take all these things seriously, but at the end of the day, we have to, obviously pray, follow our lady's mission, repent, turn back to God. At the end of the day, if we all start sinning less, it would alleviate a lot of these problems, obviously. But again, a lot of the messages we've heard as Catholics. The book is outstanding. There's much more to it. I just did a rough shot over it. I think the most pertinent parts to me that were impressed me, his affirmation of Italian fascism, that it was not a tyrannical ideology as it's been made out to be, that it had certain social structures that conformed to Catholic kingship, Catholic social doctrines, dogmas. I think the part on the Italian politics and how Italy had to be Catholicized ultimately leads to the crisis in the church, all the players that were involved and how these players got in a position of power, right? Reaffirming a lot of ideas of Catholic action being infiltrated, the Vatican being infiltrated, the deals that the church cut with like the CIA and the mob in order to keep the Marxists out. In many ways, the church, well, it didn't see what was coming. Let's put it that way. It was a desperate time, and the church no longer had a temporal defender like Mussolini, where it had to cut deals with these nefarious sources, or at least it felt like it had to. And all of this has culminated to the current world we have today now, where liberalism has rotted the culture, it's destroyed the family, it's again, it's Marxism now dominates the West, again, under different dictates, right? Under a different presentation, more of a Gramsci style Marxism, right? Where it looks to destroy the culture and ultimately align itself with globalist elites, big oligarchs of sorts, which kind of mash up together. And he brings up, again, the classical liberals, the conservatives that misjudge so much at the end of the day. He even points out how even Karl Marx was okay with an alliance of big corporation if it would serve the end purpose of pushing Marxism. And he argues that the ultimate goal was to get these globalist elites and these corporations here to push Marxism and really be the controllers of society through the money and the influence that they had. And Marxism, again, is being pushed on the West now for the past 80 years, and we seem to have lost our ability to control it. Goes through the different variations of cultural Marxism, spends a lot of time on this sort of transgender issue that's been pushed, right? This relative idea of what a man and a woman is and how that's clearly Marxist. The divisions along racial lines is another one that Marxists use, and a lot of the social fabrications that Marxism has pushed. And so guys, I'm going to recommend this one. If you guys really want an understanding of what has gone wrong in the West post World War II, especially from a Catholic perspective. And honestly, we Catholics are the only ones that can really explain this, okay? Because we are a global institution, right? We're not again, like one of these singular independent Protestant denominations where everything revolves within its local region, and they make themselves out to be right the only true bastions of Christian following in like some backward town in Kansas or what have you. No, we have a history as Catholics. We have a pedigree as Catholics. We've lived through every society and culture and governmental system that we've ever seen. Protestants have never played on a global scale. They've been too busy schisming with one another to where it all becomes personified. Everybody becomes a god in their own world in Protestantism. But we Catholics, we've seen it all. We have the pedigree that goes back for 2,000 years. Our institutions, our leaders, our prelates, our thinkers, our doctors of the church, our saints, they've seen it all. They predicted it all. And there's an analogy of faith that links this all together. And Mr. Patrick Peters does a wonderful job of giving this narrative, really since the Italian fascist regime and Mussolini. Well, actually, earlier than that, he goes all the way back to Fatima, right? Our Lady's prophecy, and through World War I, but also Italian politics and how certain things within the fascist regime, how the fall of that regime really launched us into the liberal nuttiness of Marxism taking full global control of the planet, of the West, as it's always surrendered, and how politics is not the answer anymore. And in the end, he says here that, and I think he alludes to several popes that have all said the same thing. We're so far down the rabbit hole that there's no saving the West. The West has to collapse. It has to end in some calamity of some sort. The question is, when does it fall? How does it fall? And of course, how do we recuperate once the fall happens? What does civilization look like? I don't know. I think this goes in line with a lot of the prophecies we've heard from other popes who said the church will diminish in role, will have a small remnant, the faith will be reduced down to singular homes or cottages. I believe Pope Benedict said that at one point. I know a lot of people are not fans of Pope Benedict, but the thesis makes sense to me at the end of the day, right? And the struggles that we're going to have as the world becomes more paganized, and the ultimate calamity of the fall of civilization. And again, this coincides really with the collapse of the church, right? With the church losing its faith in its own mission, the church being infiltrated by outsiders, and these outsiders that all ultimately support the grander liberal agenda of this liberal Western Republican constitutionalism thing that we all worship in the West, all of it which is falling apart. All of it, right? Despite all the claims of freedom, liberty, which Patrick Peters points out, they're just abstract ideas, right? Freedom, liberty, justice, fraternity, love, whatever you have it, they have no real meaning. They have no real purpose. They only serve, again, greater sort of institution or globalist elites that use these jargons and these slogans to mass control the population at the end of the day, to gear them like a herd in a certain direction. And we've seen a lot of that recently, right? I can't say here, but a certain issue that happened a couple of years ago where the entire planet was herded in a certain direction, right? So, the book, I got to tell you guys, it's a must read. I don't know who Patrick Peters is. I got to be honest with you. I've researched him online. If anybody's got any information about Patrick Peters, who he is, where he teaches, but it's funny. I ended this book. I was talking to a friend of mine. I said, "Geez, man, this is the book we should have wrote together." Because everything he touches on here, I've touched on this podcast for the past 3 years, and even when I was back with my good buddies over at the Knights of Christendom, these are the exact same issues we've touched on, guys. So there you have it, Botched Victory. How World War II Caused Vatican II and Corrupted the Christian West by Patrick Peters. You can find this over on Amazon. I'm going to highly recommend it, guys. It's going to open your eyes wide open to the problems of the church, the problems of society, to the problem of politics, and how the West is going off a cliff at this point in history without, again, the Roman Catholic Church in place of authority to lead its people. There you have it. I want to thank you for joining me tonight. This is Frank, sign off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.